What is going on, guys? It is WrestleGamia here, back with another video. So on this channel, we've already done profiles of some great wrestling games as well as some bad ones. We have even taken a look at some that never even came to fruition for one reason or another. There's still definitely more games to cover on that. Now the one we're looking at today, however, may qualify as one of the worst wrestling games of all time. That's right, this one is pretty much on par with Simpsons Wrestling. Now allow us to take you back to the autumn of 2000, right in the middle of the dying days of WCW, to look at one of their absolute low points, because this one should never be forgotten. Be sure to subscribe and click on that notification bell, because today we're going to look at why WCW Backstage Assault was so bad. But before we get into it, we need to backtrack a little bit first, because we're going to need some context. Like we said, WCW Backstage Assault was released in the autumn of 2000, October 31st in North America to be exact, with a European release coming less than a month later on November 24th. By this point, WCW was in its death throes. A combination of mismanagement, terrible booking, and lack of control over their own talent had led to a company who, while only a few years previously had been on the top of the wrestling world, were now struggling to draw even a percentage of that audience. Wrestlers were jumping ship at any opportunity, fan satisfaction was at an all-time low, and their chief rivals WWE by comparison were going through perhaps their greatest year of all time creatively, so all in all things looked pretty bleak for the sudden wrestling promotion. What they needed them more than anything else was a hit, something that would draw back audiences who were turning away in droves. Given the state of the company at this point, it was unlikely that this was going to be achieved on television, so video games provided a small hope of satisfying their increasingly frustrated fan base. This shouldn't have been too difficult, of course. The company had put out good games in the past, such as with the likes of WCW NWO Revenge only 2 years earlier, but the difference here though can be summed up in 2 words: electronic arts. Yeah, anyone who's played video games for any length of time will no doubt get shivers down their spine when they hear those 2 words put together. Whether it's almost killing the Star Wars games franchise, putting out mediocre copy and paste sports titles every year that dilute the series in question, or absolutely abusing microtransactions at every turn, EA have built up a reputation of being the villain to gamers everywhere over the years. The WCW game series had previously been published by THQ, but beginning with WCW Mayhem, which was released in August 1999, EA took over the reins and, true to their form, their first effort was panned by critics who lambasted it for having terrible gameplay, poor collision detection, and no depth. The question now was, would round 2 fare any better? In a word, no. It would fare far worse. Yes, unsurprisingly, the combination of WCW in the year 2000 and EA as a publisher gave us not only one of the worst wrestling games ever, but one of the worst games in general. Let's start with its most obvious failing. As the title Backstage Assault suggests, everything takes place in a backstage area, meaning there is no wrestling ring anywhere in sight in something that purports to be a wrestling game. Come on, even Simpsons Wrestling had a ring. Yeah, somebody thought this was a good idea, and throughout the whole development process, no one thought to correct them. Sounds very WCW, doesn't it? To be fair, developers Kodiak Interactive deserve their fair share of the blame here too, as they were the ones who ultimately created this abomination. Prior to this, their credits had been the aforementioned WCW Mayhem and the PC release Stratosphere Conquest of the Skies, a mostly forgotten vehicular combat game which did receive decent reviews at the time. Still, that 1-1 record would soon include 2 in the lost column after Backstage Assault was released. The game forced players to work their way through random opponents in the backstage area of an arena, winning enough of these matches to eventually get the chance to challenge the champion. The area you would always start in would be the truck area, and from there on it could be any number of backstage areas including the loading dock, storage bay, boiler room, locker room, parking lot, media room, exercise room, and the men's and women's bathroom. And bearing in mind, one playthrough doesn't mean that you'll get all of these locations, which are actually locked from the start. The only location that's available from the start is the truck area. Now, like any good wrestling game, it did at least include a good sizable roster with all the main players there, including Hollywood Hulk Hogan, Goldberg, DDP, Kevin Nash, Scott Steiner, and Ric Flair, just to name a few. Now, there would be other superstars like Bret Hart, Scott Hall, Lex Luger, Rey Mysterio Jr. and others, but they would have to be unlocked. And damn, they really went overboard with this, as you could unlock 33 wrestlers altogether. And some of these were really hard to unlock. Some you just had to defeat in the hardcore challenge mode, but others were just downright weird, as in order to unlock Norman Smiley, for example, you had to give a created wrestler the wiggle taunt, then select that wrestler in a hardcore challenge mode, do the big wiggle taunt at any time in a match to unlock Norman Smiley. Now that'd be great, but if you didn't want your created wrestler looking like an idiot in a match, then nobody would have picked a big wiggle and found this out. Some include unlocking them, as you have to set your opponent on fire in the truck area in hardcore challenge mode to unlock Vampiro. Oh, and the difficulty doesn't even stop there. In order to unlock somebody like Vince Russo, you had to beat the hardcore gauntlet for the 5th time with any wrestler. But once if you really wanted to unlock Vince Russo, then you would be able to unlock Eric Bischoff, as you would have to go through and beat the hardcore challenge with Vince Russo, which any sane-minded person wanted to play the game that many times. Now, can we just stress once again that this is a wrestling game that featured no opportunity to fight in a wrestling ring? If this isn't the most Vince Russo sounding idea ever, then we'll eat our hats. You couldn't even have a tag team match, and it's also worth noting that if you managed to play this one for long enough to actually win the title, you weren't even able to defend it. When you beat the hardcore challenge mode, it just says that you're a champion. As for the graphics, they are pretty abysmal for the time, even worse than this game's predecessor Mayhem. Some of the lower level and mid-card wrestlers fare worse, looking almost unrecognizable at times. On top of this, the custom creation suite is slow running, but they're taking ages to load just anything at all, and the commentary is made up of the same generic sound bites that we've complained about in so many other wrestling games in the past. Worst of all, the fighting mechanics are a total chore at best and infuriating at worst. There's no option to control your character's movements with the analog sticks on your controller, meaning that only the D-pad can be used. Yeah, that's great when I'm playing as Sonic on the Sega Mega Drive, but not when I'm with a 3-dimensional wrestler who has to move up and down and around the backstage area. Certain buttons also serve multiple functions, leading to numerous difficulties, such as your character picking up a weapon instead of your downed opponent who is lying next to it, or hitting a finisher when you want to grapple instead. The controls in Mayhem could never be considered good, but this is another level of awkward right here. Much of this is emphasized by the fact that there's no ring, so the traditional control scheme of a wrestling game just doesn't work, as the arena you're playing in has largely changed. BA is also significantly buggier than its predecessor, despite using the same game engine. It's incredible to think just how much worse things got here. One of its biggest flaws are the character models, which are incredibly stilted and awkward to look at, with many animations lacking proper transitions between them and others just refusing to run smoothly. Sometimes wrestlers will seemingly teleport to a spot on the screen, something which is especially noticeable when picking up weapons. One of the game's funniest botches comes in the form of Scott Steiner, who due to a modeling error is given green hair by default. WCW in 2000, you just couldn't make this stuff up. And let's not neglect to mention that the camera seems to have a mind of its own, often shifting angles at the most opportune moments to make your life that much more difficult for you. I'm not playing Resident Evil, I'm trying to play a wrestling game here. Ultimately, reviewers panned the title, and mercifully it was WCW's last video game release before going bankrupt in 2001. But could it have been saved? Could they have made a game that was actually any good? And if so, how? Well, including a damn ring would be a good start. It's the most obvious and glaring flaw here, and one that could have been easily fixed. Having an option to fight backstage is nice, as it was present in the SmackDown games, but it should never have been the whole experience. What fans were effectively getting here was a single feature spread out in a full game, but then being expected to pay full price for the pleasure. Some reviewers did have faint measures of praise, such as some liking the Creation Suite's extensive options despite its loading times, so it's not like there was nothing to work with here. To make a truly worthwhile game though, they would have had to put a hell of a lot more work in and basically rebuilt the whole thing, gameplay, concept and everything else from scratch, and given how soon the company went out of business after this, there frankly may not have been time for that to happen. Of course, it's easy enough for us to say with 2020 hindsight, and the developers at the time would have been unaware that the company they were working with was so close to dying. But with all this in mind, it may be a surprise to some, though not for those who follow this channel closely, that there was an attempt to make good from this disaster in the works, namely by putting out another game to give fans something really worth playing. So what's the legacy with this one then? Is it the game that ultimately killed WCW's foray in the video game market? Is it as this weird wrestling game that never even featured a ring? Is it as one of the worst wrestling games of all time? Well, it's a combination of all those things in truth, as well as a snapshot of WCW in the year 2000, just months before their death, a company full of hubris and bad ideas, with no one to rein either of them in. If WCW died in part because the inmates were left running the asylum, then this game died because no one took a moment to step up and tell those in charge that the whole concept behind this game was a terrible idea. Even if it had featured good gameplay, even if the graphics and sound and the character animations had been up to scratch, it wouldn't have even mattered because it was a flawed concept from the very start, and had it succeeded it would have only ended up leading to more games like it, and it wouldn't have been good for wrestling fans or gaming fans. By all means, play the game if you want if you haven't even tried it out, but if you're looking for a genuinely good one, or at least significantly better WCW game worth your time playing, go check out WCW NWO vs. The World on the original PlayStation, or the previously mentioned WCW NWO Revenge for the Nintendo 64, as both of them are far more worthy of your time and far more worthy of the WCW license, because let's never forget, it was great at one point. But there you have it guys, our look at why WCW Backstage Assault was so bad. Did you guys play this one? If so, let us know in the comments down below of what you thought of it. As always, subscribe if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. I'll see you next time with some more wrestling content.